She screamed for help from the well, and only one man had the courage to save her. It was a bright and sunny morning in the small village of Palmer. The air was warm with the scent of wildflowers, and the villagers went about their daily routines, preparing for another day of hard work. The village, nestled between rolling hills, was peaceful, with only the occasional chatter of children and the rustling of the trees breaking the stillness. For most, it was an ordinary day, with no hint of the disaster that would soon unfold. The well in the center of the village had always been a vital part of their lives. It wasn't just a place to get water. It was a gathering spot where the villagers shared stories, exchanged news, and even found comfort during tough times. But today, the well would become the focus of something no one could have imagined. The woman, insert name, was a regular at the well. She was strong, independent, and known for her hardworking nature. She had lived in the village her whole life and had never been one to shy away from challenges. That morning, like many others, she made her way to the well with a heavy wooden bucket in hand, ready to fill it with water for her family. She had been careful, as always. The well's walls were tall and the opening narrow, but she knew how to navigate it. It was a skill she had learned from her mother when she was young, and now, as an adult, she was confident in her ability to draw water without issue. But fate had other plans. As she lowered the bucket into the well, she misjudged the weight of the rope. It was slick with morning dew, and her grip slipped for just a moment. In that instant, she lost her balance. Her foot caught on the edge of the well, and before she could regain her footing, she tumbled forward. Her body hit the cold stone walls of the well, and she screamed out in surprise and fear as she fell deeper and deeper. The villagers who had been going about their tasks heard the scream echo through the air. At first, they thought it was just the sound of someone calling out to a friend or child, but the scream grew louder, more desperate. It was a cry for help. The sound sent a chill down their spines. Something was terribly wrong. One by one, the villagers gathered around the well, looking down into its dark depths. They could hear the woman's voice faintly from below, calling for help. Her voice trembled, the fear evident in every word. "Help me, please, someone help me." Her voice cracked, the desperation in it making the villagers feel helpless. The well had always been dangerous. It was deep and narrow, and no one ever went near it without a sense of caution. A few years back, a man had fallen in and never made it out. That tragic memory lingered in the minds of the villagers, causing them to hesitate when they heard the woman's cries. What if they couldn't get her out? What if they, too, ended up in the same fate? The crowd began to murmur. Some of the villagers suggested sending for help, but the nearest town was miles away, and there was no guarantee they could get help in time. Others stood in shock, frozen in place by the terrifying thought of the woman being trapped deep within the well. But there was one man in the crowd who didn't hesitate. Insert name, the farmhand, had been quietly standing at the edge of the group, watching the scene unfold. He had always been the one to take action when things went wrong. When a child had fallen from a tree, he had been the first to rush to their side. When a fire had broken out in a neighbor's barn, it had been him running with a bucket of water to help put it out. Now, hearing the woman's voice, he felt the same tug at his heart. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. His muscles tensed and his heart raced, but he knew what he had to do. Without a word to anyone, he stepped forward, moving toward the well. The villagers looked at him in surprise, some even shaking their heads in doubt. "Don't be foolish," one of the older men called out. "The well is too deep. No one can survive down there." But insert name didn't stop. He knew the risks. He had heard the stories just like everyone else. But what good would it do to stand by and watch someone suffer when he could try to help? He quickly scanned the area for a rope. Finding one lying nearby, he grabbed it, tying it securely around his waist. The rope was thick and strong, but even so, the thought of climbing down into the dark, unknown depths made his stomach churn. He took a deep breath, his nerves fluttering, but his resolve was firm. "Don't!" another voice cried out. "It's too dangerous, you'll never make it." But insert name didn't turn back. He gripped the rope tightly and with a final glance at the villagers lowered himself into the well. The darkness of the well closed around him, and the cool, damp air pressed against his face. He could hear the woman's voice more clearly now, faint but filled with panic. She was alive, but for how much longer? As he descended, the walls of the well scraped against his hands and feet. His arms ached from the strain, but he didn't stop. Every inch he moved downward, he could feel the weight of the woman's fear. The deep water in the bottom of the well was rising quickly, and he knew he didn't have much time. When he reached the bottom, he could barely see anything. The darkness was complete and the air was thick with moisture. He strained his ears, trying to locate the woman. Then in the faintest whisper, he heard her. "Please, help me." He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. She was cold and trembling. She was trapped in the water, struggling to stay afloat. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, making sure she was secure. "I've got you," he whispered, trying to reassure her. "You're going to be okay." But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to get her out, and quickly. The water was rising fast. They didn't have much time. He began to climb back up, lifting her as best as he could. The rope creaked under their combined weight, and each pull seemed harder than the last. His arms burned, but he didn't stop. The woman's cries for help had turned into soft sobs, but he could feel her clinging to him, her trust in him unspoken yet clear. It felt as though the climb would never end. The deeper the well seemed, the more the weight of the woman's life pressed on him, but he didn't stop. With each tug, he pulled himself closer to the top, closer to safety, closer to the light. He couldn't fail her now. As they neared the surface, the rope began to fray. He could hear the villagers above shouting words of encouragement, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. The water was nearly at their ankles, and the man's heart raced with fear. Would they make it out in time? Finally, with one last effort, he reached the top, pulling the woman into the safety of the waiting villagers. Exhausted and breathless, he collapsed beside her, his body trembling from the strain. The villagers rushed to help the woman, their faces filled with relief, but it was the man who had saved her. As the crowd gathered around, the man's quiet strength stood out among them. He didn't seek praise or attention, but simply the knowledge that he had done what needed to be done. The woman, her life saved, would never forget the courage of the one man who had not hesitated to risk it all. The moment the woman was pulled from the well, the air seemed to change. The tension that had gripped the villagers began to lift, but the fear still hung in the air. Everyone could see that she was safe for now, but the event had shaken them all to their core. The well, a place once viewed as a simple part of their daily lives, had transformed into a symbol of danger and uncertainty. The woman's cries echoed in their minds, and the image of the man's courage as he descended into that dark hole would forever be etched in their memories. As the woman was helped to her feet, she seemed disoriented, her eyes wide with shock. Her hands trembled as she clutched the nearby villager's arm. She wasn't badly hurt, but the ordeal had left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She looked up at the man who had saved her, his figure standing among the villagers. He was out of breath, his face pale from the strain of the rescue, but his eyes showed no sign of regret. He was calm, almost distant, as though saving her had been nothing more than a simple task. Yet the villagers could see the toll it had taken on him. The woman's voice, shaky and weak, broke the silence. "Thank you. I don't know how to. Thank you enough." Her words were soft, but there was a deep gratitude in them, one that she would carry for the rest of her life. Insert name, the man who had risked his life for her, simply nodded. His hands were still gripping the rope tightly, though it had now fallen slack. He was clearly tired, but he didn't show it. He wasn't one for words or attention. He had always been a quiet man, someone who preferred to go unnoticed. The last thing he wanted was praise. He did what needed to be done. That was enough for him. The villagers were watching him, some with awe, others with disbelief. He was not the most remarkable person in the village. In fact, many would say he was just an ordinary man. He worked on the farm, lived a simple life, and didn't seek much from the world. But today, in that moment of crisis, he had proven something to them all. He had shown them what true courage looked like. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic speeches. It was about stepping up when no one else would, taking action when everyone else was frozen by fear. The older men in the village who had stood by and watched the man descend into the well now began to talk among themselves. They whispered about how the rope had nearly snapped, how the man had come so close to danger, yet had persevered. One of the men, a former soldier, shook his head in disbelief. "He didn't even hesitate," he muttered. "Most people would have run the other way, but not him." Another man, who had been particularly vocal in his concern, was now quiet. His face was a mixture of admiration and shame. He had been the one who had warned the others against attempting a rescue. He had been the one who had doubted the man's ability to succeed. But now he could see the truth. Insert name had saved a life, and there was no denying it. Meanwhile, the woman who had been rescued was being helped to sit on a nearby bench. Her body was shaking, and she was struggling to process what had just happened. The shock was still fresh in her mind, and it was hard for her to even find the right words. She looked around at the villagers, who were watching her with concern, and then her eyes found the man who had saved her once again. She wanted to say something more, something deeper, but words didn't feel adequate. How could she express what she was feeling? How could she explain the weight of her gratitude, her relief, her respect? She had never felt so close to a stranger, so indebted to someone she barely knew. The man had risked everything for her, and in doing so had given her a second chance at life. The bond between them, though unspoken, was undeniable. In that moment, it was as if time itself had stopped, and the world had narrowed down to the two of them. Insert name caught her gaze, his expression softening for a brief moment. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her gratitude, but said nothing. He wasn't one to share his emotions easily, and he certainly wasn't looking for a hero's recognition. His thoughts were elsewhere. He had just done what he thought was right. To him, there was no need for thanks. But even as he stood there, trying to avoid the stares of the villagers, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had stepped into a role he had never expected, and it was one he wasn't sure he was ready for. The villagers began to disperse slowly, talking amongst themselves about the incredible act of bravery they had just witnessed. They spoke of how the man had faced the danger head-on and saved the woman without a second thought. But despite all the talk, insert name remained silent. He was still trying to understand what had just happened. It was a blur of emotions for him. Fear, determination, relief, each feeling seemed to come and go in waves, but through it all he had only one thought. He had saved her. That was enough. The woman, after a few moments of resting, stood up. Her legs were unsteady, but she was determined. She knew she needed to find him again, to thank him properly, to express everything she had felt during those terrifying moments in the well. She walked over to him, her steps slow but deliberate. The villagers noticed her approach, their eyes following her every move. As she reached the man, she stopped for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She had been saved by him, and now she had to let him know that she would never forget it. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice still shaky. "You saved my life. I don't think I can ever repay you for that." Her words were filled with emotion, and as she spoke, she could feel the weight of what had happened settling in her heart. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she continued. "You are braver than anyone I've ever known. You didn't hesitate, you didn't think twice. You just acted, and because of that, I'm here." Insert name looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence between them. Then he simply replied, "I just did what had to be done." His voice was quiet and there was no pride in it. It was the truth. He wasn't looking for thanks or praise. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, and that was all. The woman nodded slowly, understanding the depth of his words. She didn't need to hear more. In that simple phrase, she understood everything she needed to. He wasn't looking for admiration. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He had done what anyone with a heart would have done in his place. He had saved her without asking for anything in return. As she walked away, the man stood there, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had acted without thinking, without fear, and yet, now that the crisis was over, he felt a strange sense of unease. The villagers had seen him as a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He was just a man who had done what was right. But as he walked back to his farm, alone in his thoughts, he couldn't help but wonder what this event would mean for him in the days to come. Would the villagers look at him differently now? Would he be treated as something more than just an ordinary man? In the quiet of the evening, as the sun began to set over the village, insert name, knew one thing for certain: he had changed. And the village had changed with him. The days that followed the rescue were strange for everyone in the village. The woman who had fallen into the well, insert name, tried to return to her normal life, but everything felt different. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter, and the air felt a little heavier. It wasn't just her that felt this way. The entire village was changed in small ways, each person carrying the memory of the well with them. People moved more carefully, more aware of the danger that had once seemed so far away. But what had started as a moment of fear was now slowly turning into something else, a memory that would stay with them forever. Insert name, the man who had saved her, had become the focus of attention. He was not one to enjoy the spotlight, yet he found it difficult to avoid it. Wherever he went, the villagers looked at him differently. They whispered to each other in hushed tones, their eyes following him as he walked through the streets. To them, he was a hero, the one who had stepped into the darkness and emerged with the woman safe in his arms. But to him, it was just another day. He had done what needed to be done. There was no heroism in it. He had acted because that was the right thing to do and nothing more. It wasn't that insert name disliked the attention. He just wasn't sure how to handle it. He was used to working quietly on the farm, tending to the animals, fixing fences, and making sure everything ran smoothly. He had never expected to be looked at with such awe and respect. In his mind, he had only done what anyone would have done in his place. But the villagers didn't see it that way. They saw something extraordinary in his actions. To them, he had become more than just a farmhand. He was now a symbol of courage, of selflessness. The woman, still recovering from the shock of the fall, had not spoken much since the rescue. She had been deeply grateful, of course, but it seemed that the ordeal had left her with more than just physical exhaustion. She carried the weight of what had happened with her, and though the village tried to return to normal, it was clear that the event had affected her more than she cared to admit. She would walk through the streets, her eyes scanning the ground as if she were lost in thought, and when she did speak, it was usually in short, quiet sentences. No one asked her how she was feeling, for they could all see that she was struggling with something deeper. Despite this, she had made an effort to approach insert name, a few days after the rescue. She hadn't been sure what to say to him, but she knew she couldn't just let the days go by without expressing her gratitude. So one afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, she found herself walking toward his small farm. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached his humble home. It had been days since the rescue, but she still felt as though she hadn't properly thanked him, as though her words hadn't been enough. When she knocked on his door, she heard the faint sound of footsteps inside. The door creaked open and there stood insert name, looking as calm and composed as always. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, neither of them said anything. They both seemed to be searching for the right words, but neither could find them. Finally, it was the woman who spoke. I just wanted to thank you again," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Insert name nodded, his expression unreadable. "There's no need to thank me," he replied simply, his voice steady. "I did what anyone would have done." She bit her lip, looking down at the ground for a moment. "But not everyone would have," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard what the others said about you, about how you didn't hesitate, about how you saved me without thinking twice. That's not something just anyone does." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't think about it," he said quietly. "I just acted." The woman nodded slowly, still trying to process the enormity of what had happened. "You saved my life," she said again, as if saying it out loud made it more real. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for that. I can't even find the words to tell you how much it means to me." There was a long pause, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, insert name sighed, looking away. "You don't need to repay me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What matters is that you're safe, that's all." She looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. He was right, of course. She didn't need to repay him. But that didn't change the fact that she owed him everything. He had saved her when no one else would. He had been the one to step forward, to risk his own safety for hers. In a world where so many people hesitated, he had been the one who acted. That was something she would never forget. "I'll never forget what you did," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Never." Insert name didn't respond. He simply nodded as though the words weren't necessary. To him, they were. He didn't need gratitude or thanks. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. The woman stood there for a moment longer, unsure of what to say next. Finally, she took a deep breath, turning toward the door. "Thank you," she said again before walking away. As she left, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. She had thanked him, and though it wasn't enough, it was all she could do. She had to accept that there were some things in life that couldn't be repaid, some acts of kindness that were beyond words. But she also knew that the memory of what insert name had done for her would stay with her forever. It would shape who she was, just as it had shaped the village. Insert name watched her walk away, his mind still swirling with thoughts he didn't know how to express. He had saved her, yes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something more. In saving her, he had done more than just pull her from the well. He had given her hope. He had given the village something to believe in again. He had reminded them that, even in the darkest of times, there was always someone willing to do the right thing. But for him, the true weight of his actions was still settling. He had always lived a quiet life, content with the simple tasks of his farm and the small pleasures of the village. He had never sought recognition or praise. But now, as the days passed and the villagers continued to whisper about his bravery, he realized that he was not the same person he had been before the well. Something inside him had changed, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. As the evening sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, insert name sat down on the porch of his home, staring out at the quiet fields. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was soothing, but his mind remained restless. He had done what he had to do. He had acted, but now he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than just living quietly, more than simply going through the motions. For the first time in a long while, he felt a stirring inside him, a desire for something more. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had found something within himself that he never knew existed. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was only the beginning. The days passed, and though the village seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, there was an underlying shift that no one could ignore. Life had gone on as it always did. Farmers plowed their fields, children played in the streets, and the women gathered at the market. But the memory of the well, of the woman's screams and the man who had saved her, lingered like an echo. It wasn't something anyone could just forget. It had changed the way people looked at each other, at the world around them. The village that had once seemed small and simple now felt full of unspoken stories, untold truths. Insert name, the man who had saved the woman tried to return to his usual routine. He woke early in the morning, worked in the fields, and took care of the animals just like he had before. But nothing felt the same. The quiet life he had once cherished now felt a little heavier, and the praise he received from the villagers, though appreciated, made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. It was clear to him that the villagers now saw him differently, and though he tried to brush it off, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if he had changed, too. The woman, still recovering from the ordeal, had become a little more distant in the days following her rescue. She had spent much of her time in the company of her family, who were overjoyed to have her back safely, but her thoughts often wandered to the well, to the dark water that had nearly claimed her life. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear her own voice, frantic and desperate, calling out for help. She could still feel the weight of the cold, murky water rising around her as she clung to the edge of the well. It was a memory that would never fade. She had tried to return to her normal life, to go back to the routine she had always known, but it wasn't that simple. Every time she picked up a bucket to draw water from the well, her hands would shake. Every time she passed the spot where she had fallen, her heart would race, and the image of the man descending into the darkness to rescue her would flash in her mind. It wasn't just the fear of the well that haunted her. It was the realization that her life had been saved by someone who had risked everything for her. That was a burden she didn't know how to carry. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, the woman found herself standing near the well again. She hadn't intended to come here, but her feet had led her, almost without her thinking. She stared down into the dark opening, the memories of that day flooding back. It felt as though the well held something more than just water. It held the memories of what had happened, the lives that had been touched, and the lives that had been saved. She felt both drawn to it and repelled by it at the same time. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She had heard those footsteps many times before. It was insert name, the man who had saved her. He had been walking by, no doubt on his way home from the fields when he had seen her standing there. His presence, though quiet and unassuming, was always comforting. He never asked for anything, never expected anything in return. He simply did what needed to be done. He stopped a few steps away from her, his gaze fixed on the well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the air itself had thickened, and the weight of everything that had happened hung between them. She could feel the tension, the unspoken words they both carried, and yet neither of them knew how to bridge the silence. Finally, it was insert name who broke it. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You're still afraid of it, aren't you?" The woman turned to face him, surprised by the question. She had never spoken of her fear, not to anyone. She had tried to hide it, to move past it, but the truth was, it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "I don't know what to feel anymore," she admitted quietly. "I should be grateful, I am grateful, but every time I think about what happened, about how you saved me," she paused, her throat tightening as the words caught in her chest. "I don't know how to carry it." Insert name didn't speak right away. He simply nodded as though he understood. He had never been one for many words, but in that moment he didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. He knew what it felt like to face something that couldn't be undone, something that changed everything. And he understood the burden of gratitude, how it could feel heavy when you didn't know how to repay it. They stood there in silence for a few moments, both of them looking down at the well, the place where everything had changed. Finally, insert name spoke again. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said quietly. "What happened isn't your fault. I did what I had to do. It wasn't a choice, it was just what needed to happen." She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time since the rescue. There was a quiet strength in them, a calmness that she couldn't quite explain. She had seen him act without hesitation, had watched him descend into the well without a second thought, and now, standing beside him, she saw the depth of his character in a way she hadn't before. He wasn't a hero, not in the way the villagers saw him. He was just a man who did the right thing, and that, in its simplicity, was the most powerful thing of all. "I don't know how you can be so at peace with it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You saved me, and yet you don't want anything in return. You just did what you had to do." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Because that's what it means to live," he said simply. "We do what we have to do, not for recognition or reward, but because it's the right thing. In the end, that's all we can do." The woman felt something shift inside her. It wasn't a magical revelation, but a quiet understanding. She had been carrying her gratitude like a weight because she didn't know how to process it, how to make it right. But in that moment, standing next to insert name, she realized that she didn't have to repay him. She didn't have to find a way to make it even. What mattered was that he had done what needed to be done without expecting anything in return, and that was enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the well, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She still carried the memory of the well, of the fear and the uncertainty, but she also carried something else now. She carried the understanding that some things in life were beyond our control, and that was okay. Sometimes the only thing we could do was act when it was needed and accept that we had done our best. She turned to insert name, her heart lighter than it had been in days. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady now, "for everything." He simply nodded, his face softening for a brief moment. "You're welcome," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the distance. And though she didn't see him again that evening, the woman knew that she would always carry the memory of what had happened, of the well, the fear, and the man who had saved her without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. As the village settled into nightfall, the world seemed a little quieter, a little more at peace. And though things had changed, the woman knew that she, too, would find her way forward, one step at a time, one day at a time. As the days went on, life in the village slowly returned to its routine. The early morning mist still rose over the hills, the farmers still plowed their fields, and the children still ran and played in the streets. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, there was a quiet shift, a subtle undercurrent that flowed through the village. People didn't talk much about the well anymore. They didn't need to. The events that had unfolded there had left their mark, not just on the woman who had fallen, but on everyone who had witnessed her rescue. For insert name, life continued much as it had before. He worked in the fields, tended to the animals, and did the tasks that needed doing. But there was something different now, something that weighed on him as he worked each day. The villagers no longer saw him just as the quiet farmhand. They saw him as a hero, a man who had stepped into the darkness and emerged victorious. And while that recognition felt good in some ways, it also made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being noticed in this way. He had always been content to live a simple life, one that didn't attract attention. But the quiet life he had known was slipping away, and there was no turning back. Everywhere he went, the villagers spoke of his bravery. They would stop him in the streets, pat him on the back, and thank him for saving the woman. While the gratitude was appreciated, it also made him feel uneasy. He hadn't done it for the thanks. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. He didn't need praise or recognition. He just wanted to go back to the life he had before. The woman, on the other hand, was still adjusting to the aftermath of the ordeal. She had returned to her family, and though they were grateful to have her home, there was a subtle shift in the way things felt. She still carried the memory of the well with her, the dark, cold water, the terrifying fall, and the sound of her own voice crying out for help. But now there was something else in her heart, something that had grown from that moment of fear, a deep respect and admiration for the man who had saved her. She hadn't seen him much since that day. The village had returned to its routine, and she had kept to herself, spending her time with her family and trying to return to a sense of normalcy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. She had thanked him, of course, but that didn't seem enough. How could words ever be enough to express the depth of what he had done for her? One afternoon, after weeks of keeping her distance, she found herself walking toward his farm. It wasn't something she had planned. It was more like an impulse, a need to see him again, to thank him properly, and to understand more about what had happened between them. She didn't know what she would say or how to even begin the conversation, but she knew she couldn't keep carrying this feeling inside her any longer. When she arrived at his farm, she saw him working in the field, his back bent as he harvested the crops. His movements were steady and purposeful, but there was something in the way he moved that told her he was carrying a weight of his own. She watched him for a moment before stepping forward, her footsteps soft on the dirt path. He didn't hear her approach until she was almost right behind him. Startled, he turned to face her. His expression softened when he saw her, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure what to expect. He wiped his hands on his shirt and stood up straight, his usual quiet demeanor returning. "I didn't expect to see you today," he said, his voice calm but slightly hesitant. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began. "About you, about everything, and I needed to see you to thank you properly." He nodded but didn't speak. It was clear to her that he wasn't comfortable with this conversation, but she had come too far to turn back now. "I've been carrying this weight," she continued, her voice steady but soft. "The gratitude, the fear, the realization that I could have, that I almost didn't make it, and every time I try to move on, I find myself thinking about that moment and about you. You didn't hesitate, you just acted. You saved my life." He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking away from her for a moment. He had never been one for emotions, for displays of vulnerability. He had done what he had to do, and he wasn't looking for anything in return. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she spoke that made him feel a shift inside himself. She wasn't just thanking him, she was sharing a piece of her heart, and it made him feel something he hadn't expected to feel, something deep and raw. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it for anything other than the fact that it was the right thing to do. That's all." The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, respect, admiration, and a quiet understanding. She had known all along that he hadn't acted for any other reason than to help, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. He hadn't done it for praise. He hadn't done it for glory. He had done it because he believed it was the right thing to do. "I understand," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity, "but I can't help how I feel. You saved my life, you gave me a chance at a future, and that means everything." He didn't know how to respond to that. His feelings were tangled, and he wasn't sure what to say. But in that moment, as he looked at her, he realized something important. He had always thought of himself as ordinary, as just another person in the village doing his part. But in saving her, in doing what needed to be done, he had become part of something larger. He had made a difference. And while that didn't change who he was, it changed how he saw the world and how he saw himself. They stood there for a moment, neither of them speaking. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields. The quiet of the evening seemed to stretch on forever, and in that stillness they both understood something important. They were connected now, not just by the events of that day, but by a shared understanding. He had saved her, yes, but she had saved him too, by showing him that sometimes even the smallest act of courage can change everything. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice gentle. "I just wanted you to know that I'll never forget what you did. I'll never forget you." He looked at her, his expression softening, and for the first time in a long while he felt at peace. "You don't need to," he said quietly. "I did what was right, and that's enough." As the night fell, the two of them stood there, the world around them quiet and still. They didn't need words anymore. The bond they shared, born out of fear and courage, was something deeper than either of them could fully understand. But it was there, unspoken and strong. And as the stars began to shine above them, the woman turned to leave, knowing that she had done what she needed to do. She had thanked him. She had acknowledged the impact of his actions. And now she could move forward with a heart that was a little lighter, knowing that the man who had saved her life had found peace in his own way. Insert name watched her walk away, a sense of quiet fulfillment settling over him. He had done what he needed to do. And now life would go on. The village would go on. And though he would always carry the memory of that day, he knew that he had done something that would last, something that would never truly be forgotten.